Your concerns are noted, but we handle discipline our way here. Maybe you should focus on parenting at home instead of questioning our methods." Principal Rebecca Sterling didn't whisper those words. She delivered them with the precision of a judge's gavel, letting them echo through the cramped administrative office of Lincoln Elementary School. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in September, and those 17 words would change everything. Keisha Williams, 42 years old, sat across from the principal's desk in a simple navy blazer and dark jeans. She didn't look like the superintendent of schools for the entire district. That was intentional. This afternoon was a test, and she had no idea how badly the school would fail it. Keisha had walked into Lincoln Elementary that afternoon as any concerned parent would. Her daughter Destiny, a bright 10-year-old fourth grader, had come home with stories that made Keisha's blood run cold. Stories about being singled out in class, about harsher punishments for the same infractions that got other students warnings, about a teacher who seemed to have already decided Destiny was trouble before she'd even spoken. "I'm here about my daughter, Destiny Williams," Keisha had said calmly to the receptionist, a tired-looking woman with graying hair who barely looked up from her computer screen. "What's the issue?" the receptionist had asked, her tone suggesting this was already an inconvenience. "She's been having some challenges with her teacher, Mrs. Phillips. I'd like to speak with someone about the pattern of discipline she's been receiving." The word pattern had made the receptionist's fingers pause over her keyboard. She'd looked up then, really looked, taking in Keisha's appearance with the kind of assessment that mothers of black children know all too well. "I'll see if Principal Sterling is available," she'd said, her voice noticeably cooler. And that's how Keisha found herself in the principal's office, not as the district's highest-ranking official, but as a mother fighting for her child's right to be treated fairly. Principal Rebecca Sterling, 48 years old, had entered the office like she owned not just the room but the entire conversation. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her burgundy blazer screamed authority. She'd taken her seat behind the large oak desk and immediately began shuffling through papers, as if Keisha's presence was merely an interruption to more important work. "So, Mrs. Williams," she'd begun, not looking up from her papers, "I understand you have some concerns about Destiny's classroom experience." The way she said concerns made it sound like delusions. "Yes," Keisha had replied, her voice steady. "My daughter has been receiving disproportionate discipline compared to her classmates. Yesterday, she was sent to the office for talking during independent reading time. According to Destiny, 3 other students were also talking, but only she was removed from class." Principal Sterling had finally looked up, her expression shifting from disinterest to something that looked like annoyance. "Mrs. Williams, I'm sure Destiny told you her version of events, but children often embellish. We don't discipline students arbitrarily. If she was sent to the office, it was because her behavior warranted it." Keisha had felt that familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd had countless times growing up when adults dismissed her voice simply because she was young, black, or both. But she wasn't young anymore, and she certainly wasn't powerless. "I'm not questioning whether the discipline happened," Keisha had said carefully. "I'm questioning whether it was applied fairly. This isn't the first incident. Over the past 3 weeks, Destiny has been singled out multiple times for behaviors that other students engage in without consequence." Principal Sterling had leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting to what Keisha recognized as barely contained irritation. "Mrs. Williams, I've been an educator for over 20 years. I know the difference between fair discipline and bias. Perhaps instead of looking for discrimination where none exists, you should focus on ensuring your daughter understands the importance of following classroom rules." The words had hit like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they were so perfectly crafted to deflect responsibility while suggesting the problem lay with Keisha's parenting and her daughter's behavior. "I'm not looking for discrimination," Keisha had replied, her voice gaining strength. "I'm looking at a pattern of disproportionate discipline that follows my daughter specifically. I've documented 7 incidents in 3 weeks where—" "Documented?" Principal Sterling had interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Mrs. Williams, this isn't a courtroom. We don't operate under the assumption that our teachers are biased. If you have concerns about your daughter's adjustment to our school environment, perhaps we should discuss alternative placement options. The threat was subtle but clear. Stop questioning us, or we'll make this your daughter's problem. Keisha had taken a deep breath, drawing on years of experience dealing with exactly this kind of institutional resistance. She'd been in rooms like this before, facing administrators who saw her advocacy as aggression and her "I'm not questioning your teacher's intentions," she'd said carefully. "I'm questioning the outcomes. When a black child receives office referrals at 3 times the rate of her white classmates for the same behaviors, that's not a parenting problem. That's a systemic issue." Principal Sterling's face had flushed slightly. "Mrs. Williams, I'm going to stop you right there. We do not make disciplinary decisions based on race. That's a very serious accusation, and frankly, it's offensive. Our teachers are professionals who treat all students equally." "Then you won't mind if I request the disciplinary data for 4th grade, broken down by race?" Keisha had asked. The question had hung in the air like smoke. Principal Sterling's jaw had tightened, and for a moment, something flickered across her face that looked like panic. "That information is confidential," she'd said quickly. "And frankly, Mrs. Williams, this conversation is becoming unproductive. If you're determined to see bias where none exists, perhaps you should consider whether Lincoln Elementary is the right fit for your family." There it was. The not-so-subtle suggestion that if Keisha didn't like how things were done, she should take her child elsewhere. It was the same message delivered to countless parents who dared to question, to advocate, to demand better for their children. Keisha had stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. "Principal Sterling, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because my daughter deserves the same educational opportunities and fair treatment as every other child in this school. That's not negotiable." Principal Sterling had remained seated, looking up at Keisha with an expression that mixed irritation with something that might have been contempt. "Mrs. Williams, your concerns are noted, but we handle discipline our way here. Maybe you should focus on parenting at home instead of questioning our methods." The words had landed with the weight of centuries of similar dismissals. How many black parents had heard variations of this exact statement? How many had been told their advocacy was interference, their questions were accusations, their love for their children was somehow excessive or misguided? Keisha had looked down at Principal Sterling, her expression unreadable. "I see," she'd said quietly. "Well, thank you for your time, Principal Sterling. This conversation has been very illuminating." She'd turned to leave, but Principal Sterling's voice had stopped her. "Mrs. Williams, I hope you understand that creating a hostile environment for our staff isn't going to benefit Destiny. We're all on the same team here." Keisha had turned back, her hand on the door handle. "Are we, Principal Sterling? Are we really?" And with that, she'd walked out of the office, leaving Principal Sterling to believe she'd successfully dismissed another difficult parent. The principal had no idea that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her educational career. As Keisha walked down the hallway, past bulletin boards celebrating student achievements and colorful displays of children's artwork, she felt the familiar weight of institutional bias settling around her shoulders. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just a parent fighting for her child. She was the superintendent of schools, and she had the power to do something about it. The hallways of Lincoln Elementary were filled with the sounds of learning, children's voices reciting multiplication tables, the scratch of pencils on paper, and the soft shuffle of small feet moving from one activity to another. But Keisha heard something else in those sounds. She heard the echo of her own childhood, of countless other children who had been dismissed, overlooked, or pushed aside by adults who were supposed to protect and nurture them. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her assistant. "How did the site visit go? Need anything for tomorrow's board meeting?" Keisha looked at the message and then at the school around her. Tomorrow's board meeting was going to be very different from what anyone expected. She typed back, "Schedule a special session. We need to discuss Lincoln Elementary. As she pushed through the front doors of the school, Keisha Williams wasn't just leaving as a dismissed parent. She was leaving as a superintendent who had just witnessed firsthand the kind of treatment that drove families away from public education, that perpetuated achievement gaps, and that violated everything she believed about what schools should be. Principal Sterling had dismissed her concerns, questioned her parenting, and suggested she take her child elsewhere. In about 18 hours, Principal Sterling would learn exactly who she had been talking to. The next morning, Keisha Williams sat in her office on the 15th floor of the district's administrative building, staring at a stack of documents that painted a picture she'd hoped never to see. But there it was, in black and white and devastating detail, Lincoln Elementary's discipline data for the past 3 years. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Crystal, had worked through the night to compile the information. The numbers were worse than Keisha. "Mrs. Williams," Crystal said, setting down a steaming cup of coffee on the mahogany desk, "I've never seen data like this. In 3 years, Lincoln Elementary has referred 347 students for disciplinary action. 243 of those students were Black or Hispanic. That's 70% of referrals from a student body that's only 45% Black and Hispanic." Keisha's jaw tightened as she flipped through the pages. What about suspensions? Even worse. Of the 89 students suspended in the past 3 years, 78 were students of color. That's 88%. The coffee grew cold as Keisha absorbed the implications. This wasn't just about destiny. This was about hundreds of children whose educational experiences had been shaped by the kind of bias she'd witnessed firsthand just yesterday. "Crystal, I need you to set up individual meetings with the parents of every student who was suspended from Lincoln Elementary in the past year. I want to hear their stories." "All of them?" Crystal asked, though she was already reaching for her notepad. "All of them. And I want those meetings to happen this week. Also, pull the personnel files for every administrator and teacher at Lincoln Elementary. I want to know their training history, their disciplinary records, and any complaints filed against them." As Crystal hurried out to make the arrangements, Keisha's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "This is Superintendent Williams." "Mrs. Williams, this is Jamal Henderson. My son Marcus is in 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary. I heard through the parent network that you might be looking into some issues at the school." Keisha sat forward. "Mr. Henderson, I'd very much like to speak with you. Are you available to meet today? I can be there in an hour." Exactly 60 minutes later, Jamal Henderson sat across from Keisha in her office. He was a tall man with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. His story was heartbreakingly familiar. "Marcus is a good kid," he began, his voice carrying the weight of a father's love and frustration. "He's smart, he's funny, he loves to learn. But ever since he started at Lincoln Elementary, it's like he's been marked. Last month, he was suspended for 3 days for aggressive behavior because he raised his voice when another student took his lunch money." "What happened to the student who took his lunch money?" Keisha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Nothing. The teacher said boys will be boys, and Marcus needed to learn not to overreact." Keisha made notes as Jamal continued. "The thing is, Mrs. Williams, I've seen the same kind of thing happen to other kids. Black kids, Hispanic kids. They get suspended. We get calls about attitude problems, about disruption. But when white kids do the same things, they get warnings, they get chances, they get understanding. Have you brought these concerns to the administration?" Jamal let out a bitter laugh. "I tried. Principal Sterling told me that if I didn't like how they handled discipline, maybe I should look into a private school. She said the problem wasn't with the school, it was with kids who come from challenging home environments." There it was again, the same dismissive language, the same suggestion that the problem lay with the families rather than the institution. "Mr. Henderson, I want you to know that your concerns are being taken very seriously. Can you think of other parents who might have similar experiences?" "Mrs. Williams, I can give you a list of 20 families right now. We talk to each other, you know. We share information because we have to, because nobody else is looking out for our kids. By the end of the day, Keisha had spoken with 12 parents. Their stories varied in detail but were unified in their themes. Black and Hispanic children being disciplined more harshly than their white classmates, parents being dismissed when they raised concerns, and a school culture that seemed to view children of color as problems to be managed rather than students to be nurtured. The most disturbing story came from Tanya Davis, whose daughter had been suspended for defiance after asking to use the bathroom during a lesson. She asked twice, Tanya explained, her voice shaking with controlled anger. The teacher told her to wait. My daughter said she really needed to go, and the teacher said she was being disrespectful. They suspended her for 3 days. An 8-year-old girl suspended for needing to use the bathroom. What would have happened if she'd had an accident? Keisha asked. That's exactly what I asked Principal Sterling. She said that would have been a consequence of poor planning and disrespect for classroom rules. Keisha felt sick. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern of institutional bias that was robbing children of their educational opportunities and their sense of self-worth. That evening, Keisha sat in her home office, surrounded by files and data and the weight of what she'd discovered. Her daughter Destiny was upstairs doing homework, unaware that her mother was planning to turn her school. Her phone buzzed with a text from Crystal. Mrs. Williams, I just got a call from Principal Sterling's office. She wants to schedule a meeting with you tomorrow to discuss some concerns about a disruptive parent. She doesn't know you were that parent. Keisha stared at the message, feeling a mix of rage and disbelief. Even after their conversation yesterday, Principal Sterling was still trying to get her in trouble, still trying to paint her as the problem. She typed back, schedule the meeting. Tell her I'm very interested in discussing disruptive behavior at Lincoln Elementary. As she prepared for bed, Keisha's mind was racing with plans. Tomorrow she would walk back into Lincoln Elementary. But this time, she wouldn't be going as a dismissed parent. She would be going as the superintendent of schools, with the power to demand answers and the authority to make changes. Principal Sterling had spent 20 years believing that her way was the only way, that parents who questioned her methods were problems to be managed rather than partners in education. She'd built a culture of bias and called it discipline, created a system of inequity and called it standards. Tomorrow that system would come crashing down. At 9:15 a.m. the next morning, Keisha Williams walked through the front doors of Lincoln Elementary School. This time she wasn't alone. Crystal walked beside her, carrying a briefcase full of documents. Behind them, Dr. James Morrison, the district's Director of Equity and Inclusion, and Laura Chen, the district's legal counsel, followed in professional silence. The receptionist looked up from her computer, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to confusion as she recognized Keisha from the previous day. Mrs. Williams, are you here for another meeting about Destiny? Before Keisha could answer, Principal Sterling emerged from her office, her face lighting up with what looked like vindictive satisfaction. Mrs. Williams, I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon, but since you're here, I'm glad we can continue our conversation from yesterday. I've been thinking about your concerns, and I believe I have some suggestions that might help Destiny adjust better to our school environment. Keisha looked at Principal Sterling with an expression that was perfectly calm and completely unreadable. Actually, Principal Sterling, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let me introduce myself properly. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her identification badge, holding it up so Principal Sterling could see it clearly. I'm Dr. Keisha Williams, Superintendent of Schools for this district, and we need to talk. The color drained from Principal Sterling's face so quickly that Keisha was briefly concerned she might faint. The principal's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. I don't understand, Principal Sterling finally managed. Yesterday you said you were Destiny's mother. I am Destiny's mother, Keisha replied calmly. I'm also the superintendent of schools, and yesterday I experienced firsthand the kind of treatment that parents in this district have been complaining about for months. Principal Sterling's eyes darted to the other officials standing behind Keisha, as if hoping they might suddenly disappear or reveal this to be some kind of elaborate prank. Mrs. Williams, Dr. Williams, if I had known who you were, you would have treated me differently? Keisha interrupted. That's exactly the problem, Principal Sterling. Every parent who walks through those doors deserves the same respect and consideration that you would give to the superintendent. Every child deserves the same educational opportunities and fair treatment. The receptionist had stopped pretending to work and was openly staring at the unfolding drama. From the hallway, the sound of children's voices provided a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere in the administrative office. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in your office, Dr. Morrison suggested, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience dealing with exactly these kinds of situations. Principal Sterling nodded quickly, too shocked to do anything but comply. She led the group into her office, the same space where she'd dismissed Keisha's concerns just 24 hours earlier. Once everyone was seated, Keisha placed a thick folder on Principal Sterling's desk. These are the disciplinary records for Lincoln Elementary for the past 3 years. I've had them analyzed by our data specialists, and the patterns are troubling. Principal Sterling's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Her face grew paler as she flipped through the pages of charts and graphs that painted a clear picture of disproportionate discipline. Principal Sterling, Dr. Morrison said, his voice gentle but firm. Can you explain why black students at Lincoln Elementary are suspended at a rate 400% higher than white students? We don't discipline based on race, Principal Sterling stammered. We discipline based on behavior. Then why, Laura Chen interjected, do black students receive office referrals for subjective infractions like disrespect and defiance at rates far exceeding their white classmates, while white students receive office referrals primarily for objective infractions like tardiness or The questions kept coming, each one supported by data, each one revealing another layer of the systematic bias that had been operating at Lincoln Elementary. I want to call a meeting, Keisha said finally. All teachers, all support staff, all administrators. I want everyone in the auditorium in 30 minutes. Dr. Williams, Principal Sterling said, her voice barely above a whisper, I think there might be some misunderstanding about our disciplinary procedures. Perhaps if we could discuss this privately. Principal Sterling, there's no misunderstanding. There's a pattern of discriminatory discipline that has been harming children for years, and it stops today. As if summoned by the tension in the room, there was a knock on the office door. Vice Principal Brian Mitchell entered, his face showing confusion at the unexpected crowd in the principal's office. Rebecca, I got your message about the meeting with the superintendent, but I thought... Oh. His voice trailed off as he saw Keisha sitting behind the desk. Mr. Mitchell, Keisha said, standing up. I'm Dr. Williams, the district superintendent. We were just discussing some concerns about disciplinary practices at Lincoln Elementary. Brian Mitchell's face went through the same transformation as Principal Sterling's had minutes earlier. Yes, ma'am. Is there something I can do to help? Actually, there is. I understand you were involved in the decision to suspend Destiny Williams' classmate Marcus Henderson for aggressive behavior when he objected to having his lunch money stolen. The vice principal's eyes widened. How did you... I've been speaking with parents, Mr. Mitchell, lots of parents, and I've been hearing some very disturbing stories about how discipline is handled at this school. Over the next 20 minutes, more staff members were called into the office. Karen Phillips, the 4th grade teacher who had been sending Destiny to the office for minor infractions. Linda Harper, the school counselor who had been recommending anger management classes for black students at disproportionate rates. Steve Walsh, the security guard who had been called to remove disruptive parents from the building. Each arrival brought the same shocking recognition, the same stammered explanations, the same desperate attempts to backtrack and justify. I think, Keisha said finally, it's time for that all-staff meeting. The walk to the auditorium felt like a funeral procession. Principal Sterling moved like someone in a trance. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. The other staff members followed in stunned silence, the weight of their situation becoming clearer with each step. As they entered the auditorium, Keisha could see the confusion on the faces of the teachers and staff who had been hastily assembled. They had been told only that there was an emergency meeting with the district superintendent, but most had no idea what was coming. Keisha took the stage with the same calm presence she'd maintained throughout the morning. Behind her, Crystal set up a laptop connected to a projector, ready to display the data that would make everything clear. "Good morning," Keisha began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium. "I'm Dr. Keisha Williams, your district superintendent. I'm here today because of some very serious concerns about the climate and culture at Lincoln Elementary." She clicked to the first slide, showing the school's demographic breakdown alongside its disciplinary data. Over the past 3 years, this school has suspended 89 students. 78 of those students were Black or Hispanic. In a school that is 45% students of color, that means 88% of your suspensions are affecting minority students. A murmur ran through the auditorium. Some teachers looked genuinely shocked, others appeared uncomfortable, and a few had the guilty expressions of people who had known something was wrong but had chosen to remain silent. "Yesterday," Keisha continued, "I visited this school as a parent. I came here with concerns about my daughter's treatment in the classroom. I was dismissed, my parenting was questioned, and I was told that if I didn't like how things were done here, I should consider taking my child elsewhere." The murmur grew louder. Teachers began looking around at each other, trying to figure out which of their colleagues had spoken to the superintendent. "I want to be very clear," Keisha said, her voice rising slightly. "This is not about one teacher or one administrator. This is about a culture that has allowed bias to flourish, that has normalized disproportionate discipline, and that has failed our students of color." She clicked to the next slide, showing specific examples of disciplinary disparities. A Black student was suspended for 3 days for defiance after asking to use the bathroom. A Hispanic student referred to the office for disrespect after asking for help with an assignment. A white student who brought a weapon to school received a warning, while a Black student who brought the same type of item The auditorium was completely silent now. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. "I've spent the past 2 days talking to parents," Keisha continued. "Parents who love their children, who want the best for their children, and who have been told repeatedly that they are the problem. Parents who have been dismissed, ignored, and pushed aside when they've tried to advocate for their children." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "That stops today." The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Keisha could see the faces of the staff members, ranging from shock to shame to what looked like genuine confusion. It was clear that while some had been active participants in the discriminatory practices, others had simply been blind to what was happening around them. "I want to share some specific examples," Keisha continued, clicking to the next slide. "These are real cases from the past year, though I've removed the names to protect the students involved." The slide showed a comparison chart that made the bias impossible to ignore. 2 students, both in 3rd grade, both caught talking during quiet time. Student A, who is white, received a verbal warning. Student B, who is Black, was sent to the office and received a written referral. When Student B's parents asked about the disparity, they were told that Student B had a history of disruption. She clicked again. Student B's total disciplinary history: 2 previous incidents, asking to sharpen a pencil without permission and accidentally dropping a book. A gasp went through the audience. Karen Phillips, the 4th grade teacher, had gone white as a sheet. 2 students, both in 2nd grade, both arrived late to class. Student A, who is white, was marked tardy. Student B, who is Hispanic, was sent to the office for disrespect because he explained that his bus was late. The examples continued, each one more damning than the last. The pattern was clear, undeniable, and heartbreaking. "I want to be clear about something," Keisha said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "This isn't about mistakes. This isn't about misunderstandings. This is about a systematic pattern of bias that has been operating in this school for years. She gestured to Principal Sterling, who was sitting in the front row, looking like she wanted to disappear. Yesterday, when I came here as a parent, I was told that my concerns were noted, but that the school would handle discipline our way. I was told that I should focus on parenting at home instead of questioning our methods. The auditorium was so quiet that the sound of someone's phone buzzing seemed as loud as a fire alarm. I want every person in this room to understand something, Keisha continued. Every parent who walks through those doors has the right to advocate for their child. Every parent has the right to question practices that seem unfair. And every parent has the right to be treated with respect and dignity. She clicked to the next slide, showing a graph of parent complaints over the past 3 years. In the past 3 years, 47 parents have filed formal complaints about disciplinary practices at Lincoln Elementary. Of those 47 complaints, 43 came from parents of color. And of those 43 complaints, 41 were dismissed without investigation. Linda Harper, the school counselor, raised her hand tentatively. Dr. Williams, many of those complaints were, well, they didn't have merit. Parents sometimes overreact to standard disciplinary procedures. Keisha fixed her with a stare that could have frozen water. Ms. Harper, you recommended anger management counseling for 23 students last year. 22 of those students were Black or Hispanic. Can you explain that disparity? Those students were showing signs of aggression and defiance, such as, well, they had attitude problems, they talked back to teachers, they didn't follow instructions properly. Ms. Harper, I have the files here. Would you like me to read some of the specific behaviors that led to your recommendations? Linda Harper's face flushed red. That won't be necessary. I think it will be, Keisha said, opening a file folder. Marcus Henderson, age 9, recommended for anger management after aggressively defending himself when his lunch money was stolen. The aggressive behavior? He raised his voice and said, "That's not fair." She flipped to another page. Destiny Williams, age 10, recommended for counseling after showing defiant behavior in class. The defiant behavior? She asked if she could finish her math problems before cleaning up her desk. The examples went on, each one revealing the shocking subjectivity that had been passed off as professional assessment. I want to be very clear, Keisha said, closing the file. This isn't about political correctness or walking on eggshells. This is about treating all children with the same standards and the same dignity. She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from other schools in the district. Roosevelt Elementary, which serves a similar demographic, has a suspension rate that's 60% lower than Lincoln Elementary. Washington Elementary, which serves an even higher percentage of students of color, has a suspension rate that's 40% lower. So we know it's possible to maintain discipline and order without resorting to discriminatory practices. Vice Principal Brian Mitchell cleared his throat. Dr. Williams, I think there might be some factors you're not considering. Lincoln Elementary serves a more challenging population, with more students from unstable home environments. Stop, Keisha said sharply. Stop right there. I don't want to hear about challenging populations or unstable home environments. I want to hear about what you're doing to support all of your students, regardless of their background. She clicked to the next slide, showing academic achievement data. You want to know what's really challenging? The fact that Black students at Lincoln Elementary are reading below grade level at twice the rate of white students. The fact that Hispanic students are being referred to special education at rates that far exceed their representation in the general population. The fact that students of color are being suspended at rates that guarantee they'll fall further behind academically. The room was completely silent now. Even the teachers who had initially looked defensive were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been happening. I've been in education for over 20 years, Keisha continued. I've seen schools transform when they commit to equity. I've seen the same students who were labeled as problems thrive when they're given the support and respect they deserve. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of the staff members. But I've also seen what happens when schools refuse to change. I've seen talented teachers lose their jobs. I've seen administrators transferred to positions where they can't harm students. I've seen entire school cultures dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. The threat was clear, but it was delivered with the calm professionalism of someone who had the authority to make good on it. "So here's what's going to happen," Keisha said, clicking to the final slide. "Effective immediately, Lincoln Elementary will be placed under intensive monitoring. Every disciplinary action will be reviewed by the district office. Every parent complaint will be investigated thoroughly, and every staff member will undergo mandatory training on bias, equity, and restorative justice practices." She looked directly at Principal Sterling. "Furthermore, I'm ordering a complete review of all disciplinary decisions made in the past year. Any student who was suspended or referred to alternative placement will have their case reviewed by an independent panel." The implications were staggering. If students had been unfairly suspended, they would need to be compensated for lost instructional time. If they had been unfairly referred to alternative placements, they would need to be allowed to return to their home schools. The legal and financial ramifications alone would be enormous. "I want to be clear," Keisha said, her voice softening slightly. "This isn't about punishment. This is about accountability. This is about making sure that every child who walks through those doors gets the education they deserve." She closed her laptop and looked around the room one more time. "I'll be back next week to check on your progress. I expect to see immediate changes in how students are treated, how parents are received, and how discipline is administered. And I expect to see those changes reflected in your data." As she gathered her materials, Keisha could hear the whispered conversations beginning around the auditorium. Some teachers were already planning how they would adjust their practices. Others were clearly in shock at the magnitude of what had been revealed. Principal Sterling approached the stage, her face ashen. "Dr. Williams, I want to apologize. I had no idea that—" "Principal Sterling," Keisha interrupted gently. "You had every idea. You chose to ignore it." She looked at the woman who had dismissed her concerns just 24 hours earlier. "But I want you to understand something, Principal Sterling. This isn't the end of your career unless you choose for it to be. You have an opportunity here to learn, to grow, and to become the kind of leader this school needs. The question is, what are you going to do with that opportunity?" Principal Sterling's eyes filled with tears. I don't know where to start." "Start by listening," Keisha said simply. "Really listening. To your students, to your teachers, to your parents. And start by acknowledging that the way things have been done isn't working for everyone." As Keisha left the auditorium, she could feel the weight of what had just transpired. She had exposed a system of bias that had been operating in plain sight, harming children and dismissing parents for years. But more importantly, she had opened the door for change. The real work was just beginning. Word traveled fast in a school district. By the end of the week, every administrator, every teacher, and every parent in the district had heard about what happened at Lincoln Elementary. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing and evolving with each telling. Some versions portrayed Keisha as a hero, a superintendent who had gone undercover to expose institutional racism. Others painted her as a manipulative troublemaker who had entrapped innocent educators. But regardless of how the story was told, everyone agreed on one thing. The educational landscape in their district had funded. Vice Principal Brian Mitchell cleared his throat. "Dr. Williams, I think there might be some factors you're not considering. Lincoln Elementary serves a more challenging population, with more students from unstable home environments." "Stop," Keisha said sharply. "Stop right there. I don't want to hear about challenging populations or unstable home environments. I want to hear about what you're doing to support all of your students, regardless of their background." She clicked to the next slide, showing academic achievement data. "You want to know what's really challenging? The fact that Black students at Lincoln Elementary are reading below grade level at twice the rate of white students. The fact that Hispanic students are being referred to special education at rates that far exceed their representation in the general population. The fact that students of color are being suspended at rates that guarantee they'll fall further behind academically. The room was completely silent now. Even the teachers who had initially looked defensive were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been happening. "I've been in education for over 20 years, Keisha continued. "I've seen schools transform when they commit to equity. I've seen the same students who were labeled as problems thrive when they're given the support and respect they deserve." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of the staff members. "But I've also seen what happens when schools refuse to change. I've seen talented teachers lose their jobs. I've seen administrators transferred to positions where they can't harm students. I've seen entire school cultures dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up." The threat was clear, but it was delivered with the calm professionalism of someone who had the authority to make good on it. "So here's what's going to happen," Keisha said, clicking to the final slide. "Effective immediately, Lincoln Elementary will be placed under intensive monitoring. Every disciplinary action will be reviewed by the district office. Every parent complaint will be investigated thoroughly, and every staff member will undergo mandatory training on bias, equity, and restorative justice practices." She looked directly at Principal Sterling. "Furthermore, I'm ordering a complete review of all disciplinary decisions made in the past year. Any student who was suspended or referred to alternative placement will have their case reviewed by an independent panel." The implications were staggering. If students had been unfairly suspended, they would need to be compensated for lost instructional time. If they had been unfairly referred to alternative placements, they would need to be allowed to return to their home schools. The legal and financial ramifications alone would be enormous. "I want to be clear," Keisha said, her voice softening slightly. "This isn't about punishment. This is about accountability. This is about making sure that every child who walks through those doors gets the education they deserve." She closed her laptop and looked around the room one more time. "I'll be back next week to check on your progress. I expect to see immediate changes in how students are treated, how parents are received, and how discipline is administered. And I expect to see those changes reflected in your data." As she gathered her materials, Keisha could hear the whispered conversations beginning around the auditorium. Some teachers were already planning how they would adjust their practices. Others were clearly in shock at the magnitude of what had been revealed. Principal Sterling approached the stage, her face ashen. "Dr. Williams, I want to apologize. I had no idea that—" "Principal Sterling," Keisha interrupted gently. "You had every idea. You chose to ignore it." She looked at the woman who had dismissed her concerns just 24 hours earlier. "But I want you to understand something, Principal Sterling. This isn't the end of your career unless you choose for it to be. You have an opportunity here to learn, to grow, and to become the kind of leader this school needs. The question is, what are you going to do with that opportunity?" Principal Sterling's eyes filled with tears. I don't know where to start." "Start by listening," Keisha said simply. "Really listening. To your students, to your teachers, to your parents. And start by acknowledging that the way things have been done isn't working for everyone." As Keisha left the auditorium, she could feel the weight of what had just transpired. She had exposed a system of bias that had been operating in plain sight, harming children and dismissing parents for years. But more importantly, she had opened the door for change. The real work was just beginning. Word traveled fast in a school district. By the end of the week, every administrator, every teacher, and every parent in the district had heard about what happened at Lincoln Elementary. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing and evolving with each telling. Some versions portrayed Keisha as a hero, a superintendent who had gone undercover to expose institutional racism. Others painted her as a manipulative troublemaker who had entrapped innocent educators. But regardless of how the story was told, everyone agreed on one thing. The educational landscape in their district had "That's the insidious thing about unconscious bias," Keisha replied. "It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a sign. It just quietly shapes how we interpret actions and assign motivations. So, how do I fix it? How do I make sure this never happens again?" Keisha leaned back in her chair. "Rebecca, the first step is acknowledging that you can't fix it alone. You need systems. You need checks and balances. You need people who will call you out when you're falling back into old patterns. Would you be willing to help me set up those systems? It was a question Keisha had been hoping to hear. Rebecca, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. There are people in this district who want me to fire you. They think you're beyond redemption, that you represent everything that's wrong with public education. Rebecca's face went pale. Are you going to fire me? Not if you're genuinely committed to change. But you need to understand that you're going to be under a microscope. Every decision you make, every interaction you have, and every policy you implement is going to be scrutinized. Are you ready for that? I have to be, Rebecca said. Because the alternative is living with the knowledge that I hurt children, that I made parents feel like their concerns didn't matter, that I perpetuated a system that was failing the kids I was supposed to protect. Over the following weeks, the changes at Lincoln Elementary were dramatic and visible. Rebecca Sterling had indeed called every parent who had filed a complaint, spending hours listening to stories that broke her heart and opened her eyes. She had implemented new procedures for disciplinary actions, requiring documentation and justification for every referral. She had partnered with Dr. Morrison to bring in trainers who specialized in unconscious bias and restorative justice practices. But perhaps most importantly, she had begun to change the culture of the school itself. Mrs. Sterling, said Maria Gonzalez, the mother of a third grader who had been suspended twice the previous year, I have to tell you, I never thought I'd see the day when a principal would call me to apologize, and not just apologize, but really listen to what I had to say. The conversation was taking place in Rebecca's office, but the dynamic was completely different from the tense confrontations of the past. Rebecca was leaning forward, taking notes, asking questions, and treating Maria as a partner in her son's education rather than a problem to be managed. Maria, I want you to know that I'm committed to making sure Diego gets the support he needs to succeed. And I want you to know that if you ever have concerns about his treatment, I want to hear about them immediately. I appreciate that, Mrs. Sterling, but I have to ask, what's to stop things from going back to the way they were? What happens when the attention dies down and everyone moves on to the next crisis? It was a fair question, and one that Rebecca had been grappling with herself. Maria, I can't promise that I'll never make mistakes, but I can promise that I've put systems in place to catch those mistakes before they hurt kids. And I can promise that I'll never again dismiss a parent's concerns the way I dismissed others in the past. The proof of the changes came in the data. Within 2 months, office referrals at Lincoln Elementary had dropped by 40%. The racial disparity in discipline had narrowed significantly, though it hadn't disappeared entirely. Parent satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in how families felt they were being treated by the school. But the most telling indicator came from the students themselves. Mom, Destiny Williams said one evening as she and Keisha were working on homework together, something's different at school. Mrs. Phillips doesn't send kids to the office as much anymore. And when she does, she talks to us first to find out what really happened. Keisha looked up from the papers she was grading. How do you feel about that? I feel like she actually cares about us now, like she wants to help us instead of just getting rid of us when we make mistakes. It was a simple observation from a 10-year-old, but it captured everything that Keisha had been trying to achieve. The goal wasn't to eliminate all discipline or to excuse inappropriate behavior. The goal was to create an environment where children felt valued and supported, where their mistakes were seen as opportunities for learning rather than reasons for punishment. The changes at Lincoln Elementary didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the district. Other schools began examining their own disciplinary practices, some voluntarily and others under pressure from parents who had been emboldened by. At Roosevelt Elementary, Principal Janet Martinez called a faculty meeting to review their own discipline data. What she found was concerning, though not as extreme as what had been happening at Lincoln Elementary. I want everyone to look at this chart, she said, displaying the data on a projector. We're seeing some disparities that we need to address. Black students are being suspended at rates that are 50% higher than white students. Hispanic students are being referred to the office for subjective infractions at higher rates than their white classmates. The discussion that followed was heated but productive. Some teachers were defensive, insisting that they treated all students fairly. Others were genuinely shocked by the data and eager to understand how their unconscious biases might be affecting their students. "I never realized," said Tom Bradley, a veteran fifth-grade teacher. I always thought I was being consistent. But looking at these numbers, I can see that maybe I've been interpreting the same behaviors differently depending on who was doing them." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with teachers sharing examples of situations where they might have unconsciously applied different standards to different students. It was uncomfortable work, but it was necessary work. At Washington Elementary, Principal David Kim took a different approach. He invited parents to a series of community meetings where they could share their experiences and concerns about discipline practices at the school. "I want to hear from you," he said at the first meeting, which was packed with parents from all backgrounds. "I want to know if you've ever felt like your child was being treated unfairly. I want to know if you've ever felt dismissed when you raised concerns, and I want to know how we can do better." The stories that emerged were remarkably similar to what had been happening at Lincoln Elementary. Black and Hispanic parents described feeling like they were viewed as troublemakers when they advocated for their children. They talked about being told that their children had attitude problems or came from challenging backgrounds. They described watching their children lose confidence and enthusiasm for learning as they were repeatedly disciplined for minor infractions. But white parents also shared their perspectives, and many were surprised to learn about the disparities in treatment. "I had no idea," said Jennifer Walsh, whose daughter was in 3rd grade. I knew that Sarah sometimes got away with things that other kids got in trouble for, but I just thought she was lucky or that the teachers liked her. I never thought about it in terms of race." The meetings continued for several weeks, with parents and educators working together to develop new approaches to discipline that emphasized consistency, fairness, and support for all students. Meanwhile, at the district level, Keisha was working with her team to implement systematic changes that would prevent the kinds of problems that had been festering at Lincoln Elementary. "We need to change how we collect and analyze discipline data," she told Dr. Morrison during one of their weekly meetings. "We can't wait for parents to complain or for situations to explode. We need to be proactively monitoring for disparities and addressing them before they become entrenched." Dr. Morrison nodded. "I've been working on a dashboard that will show real-time discipline data for every school in the district. Principals will be able to see immediately if certain groups of students are being disciplined at disproportionate rates." "Good, and I want that data to be public. Parents should be able to see how their school is performing in terms of equity. Transparency breeds accountability." They also worked on revising the district's disciplinary policies, moving away from zero-tolerance approaches that had been shown to disproportionately affect students of color. Instead, they emphasized restorative justice practices that focused on repairing harm and helping students learn from their mistakes. "The goal," Keisha explained to the school board at their monthly meeting, "is to create environments where all students feel safe, valued, and supported, where discipline is about teaching and learning, not about punishment and exclusion." The board members, who had initially been skeptical of Keisha's aggressive approach to the Lincoln Elementary situation, were beginning to see the positive results of her reforms. "Dr. Williams," said board member Patricia Chen, "I have to admit that I was concerned about the disruption that your investigation might cause, but I'm seeing improvements not just in discipline data, but in academic achievement, parent satisfaction, and teacher morale. It seems like addressing these equity issues has had benefits across the board." "That's because equity isn't just about being fair," Keisha replied. "It's about creating conditions where all students can thrive. When we eliminate barriers and biases, everyone benefits." The changes weren't limited to the school district. News of what had happened at Lincoln Elementary had spread to other districts, and Keisha found herself fielding calls from superintendents across the state who wanted to learn. Dr. Williams, said Dr. Michael Thompson, the superintendent of a district about an hour away, we're seeing similar patterns in some of our schools. Would you be willing to share your approach to addressing these issues? Keisha was happy to help, but she was also careful to emphasize that there was no quick fix or magic formula. The first step, she told Dr. Thompson, is acknowledging that the problem exists. You can't fix something that you're not willing to admit is broken. And you have to be prepared for pushback because challenging systems of bias is never easy or comfortable. She also emphasized the importance of involving all stakeholders in the process of change. You can't do this from the top down, she explained. You need teachers who are willing to examine their own practices. You need parents who are willing to share their experiences. You need students who feel safe enough to speak up when they're being treated unfairly. And you need administrators who are willing to be held accountable for creating equitable environments. While the professional impact of Keisha's actions had been largely positive, the personal cost had been significant. She had received hundreds of emails, some supportive, but many others filled with anger and accusations. She had been called everything from a hero to a race baiter to a divisive troublemaker. The most hurtful comments came from people who questioned her motives and her methods. "You set up that poor principal," read one email. "You used your position of power to embarrass and humiliate a dedicated educator who was just trying to do her job." Another message was more direct. "You're the reason why good teachers are leaving the profession. You're creating a hostile environment where educators are afraid to discipline students because they might be accused of racism." The criticism wasn't limited to anonymous emails. At a school board meeting, several community members had spoken during the public comment period, expressing their concerns about Keisha's leadership. "Dr. Williams has created a culture of fear in our schools," said Robert Martinez, a parent of 2 high school students. "Teachers are afraid to maintain discipline because they're worried about being accused of bias. This is going to lead to chaos in our classrooms." Another speaker, Lisa Johnson, was even more direct. What Dr. Williams did was entrapment, pure and simple. She deceived Principal Sterling and then used her position to destroy her reputation. "This is not the kind of leadership we need in our schools." The comments stung, but Keisha had expected them. She knew that challenging systems of bias would be uncomfortable and controversial. She knew that some people would see her actions as an attack on good educators rather than an effort to protect vulnerable students. At home, the stress was taking its toll. Destiny had heard some of the criticism and was confused about why people were angry at her mother. "Mom, Mrs. Johnson at the grocery store said you were being mean to my teachers. Is that true?" Keisha sat down with her daughter, trying to find words that would be both honest and age-appropriate. "Destiny, sometimes when we try to make things fairer for everyone, some people get upset because they like the way things were. I wasn't being mean to your teachers. I was trying to make sure that all students get treated the same way." But why are people so angry? It was a question that Keisha had been asking herself. Why was the pursuit of equity so threatening to some people? Why did efforts to eliminate bias generate such strong reactions? Sometimes, sweetie, people get angry when they're asked to change, even if the change is for the better. And sometimes people get angry when they're told that something they thought was fair actually wasn't fair for everyone. The conversation with her daughter reminded Keisha of why she had taken this job in the first place. It wasn't for the salary or the prestige or the power. It was for children like Destiny and Marcus and all the other students who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Her husband David had been supportive throughout the ordeal, but she could see the strain in his eyes. "Keisha, I'm proud of what you did," he said one evening as they were cleaning up after dinner. "But I'm worried about you. You're working 18-hour days. You're getting death threats, and you're carrying the weight of an entire district on your shoulders." "I know it's hard," she replied. "But if I don't do this, who will? If I don't use my position to protect these kids, what's the point of having it? I understand that, but you can't save every child if you burn yourself out. You need to take care of yourself too. It was advice that Keisha struggled to follow. She felt a sense of urgency about the work, knowing that every day that passed without change meant more children being subjected, but she also knew that David was right. The work of creating equitable schools was a marathon, not a sprint. She needed to pace herself if she wanted to be effective in the long term. One of the most surprising developments in the aftermath of the Lincoln Elementary incident was the emergence of unexpected allies. Teachers and administrators who had initially been defensive or skeptical began to see the value of the equity work that Keisha was promoting. Karen Phillips, the fourth-grade teacher who had been sending Destiny to the office for minor infractions, requested a meeting with Keisha 6 weeks after the confrontation. "Dr. Williams, I want to apologize for how I treated Destiny and other students in my class," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been doing some soul-searching, and I realized that I was seeing misbehavior in black students that I was overlooking in white students." Keisha was surprised by the teacher's directness. "Karen, I appreciate you saying that. Can you tell me more about what you've realized?" "I've been keeping a log of my disciplinary actions, and the patterns are obvious once you really look at them. I was interpreting the same behaviors differently depending on who was doing them. A white student who spoke out of turn was being enthusiastic. A black student who spoke out of turn was being disrespectful." Karen went on to describe how she had been working to change her practices, asking herself hard questions about her assumptions and biases. "I've started pausing before I react to any behavior," she explained. "I ask myself, would I respond the same way if this were a different student? Would I assign the same motivation to this behavior if it were coming from a white student?" The conversation continued for over an hour, with Karen sharing specific examples of how she had been changing her approach to classroom management. She talked about replacing punitive responses with restorative conversations, about focusing on teaching appropriate behavior rather than just punishing inappropriate behavior. "The amazing thing," Karen said, "is that my classroom runs more smoothly now. Students are more engaged, more willing to take risks, and more likely to ask for help when they need it. I think they can sense that I'm seeing them as individuals rather than as problems to be managed." Similar conversations were happening throughout the district. Teachers were examining their own practices, administrators were questioning their assumptions, and parents were becoming more involved in advocating for equity. Steve Walsh, the security guard who had been called to remove disruptive parents from Lincoln Elementary, had undergone his own transformation. "Dr. Williams, I want you to know that I've been thinking about all the times I was called to deal with difficult parents," he said during a chance encounter in the district office. "Looking back, I realized that most of those parents weren't being difficult. They were just trying to get someone to listen to their concerns about their children." Steve had volunteered to participate in training sessions about implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. He was learning how to recognize when his own assumptions might be affecting his interactions with parents and students. "I'm trying to see parents as partners instead of potential problems," he explained. "And I'm trying to understand that when a parent is upset, it's usually because they love their child and want what's best for them." The changes weren't limited to individual staff members. Entire schools were beginning to embrace new approaches to discipline and parent engagement. At Jefferson Middle School, Principal Amanda Foster had implemented a program called Parent Partnership Circles, where parents and school staff met monthly to discuss concerns and share strategies for supporting students. "We used to see parent complaints as attacks on our professionalism," Amanda explained to Keisha during a school visit. "Now we see them as valuable feedback that helps us improve our practices." The program had been remarkably successful, with parent satisfaction scores increasing dramatically and disciplinary referrals decreasing by 30%. "Parents are telling us that they feel heard and respected," Amanda continued, "and students are telling us that they feel safer and more supported. It's amazing what happens when you create an environment of trust and collaboration." Even some of the harshest critics of Keisha's approach were beginning to acknowledge the positive changes they were seeing. Robert Martinez, who had criticized Keisha at the school board meeting, approached her after a district event several months later. "Dr. Williams, I owe you an apology," he said. "I was wrong about what you were trying to do. My son is in high school now, and he's been telling me about some of the changes he's seeing and how teachers interact with students. He says it feels fairer, more respectful. I guess I didn't understand what you were really—" These moments of recognition and growth were deeply meaningful to Keisha. They reminded her that change was possible, that people were capable of examining their own biases and adjusting their behaviors accordingly. As the immediate crisis at Lincoln Elementary receded into the background, Keisha began to focus on the long-term systemic changes that would be necessary to create truly equitable schools throughout the district. She convened a task force of teachers, administrators, parents, and community members to develop a comprehensive equity plan for the district. "We can't just fix individual schools one at a time," she explained to the group at their first meeting. "We need to create systems and structures that promote equity across all of our schools, for all of our students." The task force spent months studying best practices from other districts, analyzing their own data, and gathering input from stakeholders throughout the community. The plan that emerged was ambitious and comprehensive. It included new policies for disciplinary practices, revised procedures for parent engagement, mandatory training for all staff on implicit bias and cultural competency, and regular audits of school climate and culture. The goal, Keisha explained to the school board as she presented the plan, is to create an environment where every student, regardless of their race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or background, has the opportunity to succeed. The plan also included specific metrics for measuring progress, with regular reporting to the community on how well the district was meeting its equity goals. "We're committing to transparency and accountability," Keisha continued. "We're going to track our progress, share our data with the public, and hold ourselves responsible for creating the kind of schools that all of our students deserve." The board approved the plan unanimously, but Keisha knew that the real work was just beginning. Implementing systemic change in a large school district was a massive undertaking that would require sustained effort and commitment from everyone involved. She also knew that there would be setbacks and challenges along the way. Not every teacher would embrace the new approaches immediately. Not every administrator would be willing to examine their own biases. Not every parent would be satisfied with the changes. But the foundation had been laid. The conversation about equity had been started, and the expectation had been established that all students would be treated with dignity and respect. A year after the confrontation at Lincoln Elementary, Keisha found herself reflecting on everything that had happened and everything that had been learned. The data told a compelling story. Disciplinary disparities had been reduced significantly across the district. Parent satisfaction scores had increased dramatically. Student achievement gaps had begun to narrow, though there was still much work to be done. But perhaps more importantly, the culture of the district had changed. There was a new awareness of the importance of equity, a new willingness to examine practices and assumptions, and a new commitment to creating inclusive environments for all students. Principal Rebecca Sterling had become one of the most vocal advocates for equity in the district. She regularly spoke at conferences and workshops, sharing her story of transformation and encouraging other educators to examine their own practices. "I thought I was being fair," she would tell audiences. "I thought I was treating all students equally. But I was wrong. I was allowing my unconscious biases to shape how I saw and responded to student behavior. And in doing so, I was harming the very children I was supposed to be protecting." Rebecca's honesty about her own journey had made her a powerful voice for change. Other administrators who might have been defensive or resistant to equity initiatives were willing to listen to her because she had been where they were. "The hardest part," Rebecca would often say, "was admitting that I had been wrong. But once I did that, once I stopped defending my past actions and started focusing on how I could do better, everything changed." The changes at Lincoln Elementary had been dramatic. The school had gone from being one of the most problematic in the district to being held up as a model for equitable practices. Test scores had improved, chronic absenteeism had decreased, and parent engagement had increased significantly. But Keisha knew that the work was far from over. Creating equitable schools was an ongoing process, not a destination. It required constant vigilance, continuous learning, and unwavering commitment to the principle that all students deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. She also knew that the lessons learned from the Lincoln Elementary incident had applications far beyond education. The same kinds of unconscious biases that had been operating in the school existed in workplaces, healthcare systems, criminal justice institutions, and countless other areas. The thing about bias, she reflected during a presentation to a group of community leaders, is that it's not limited to overtly racist people. It's something that affects all of us, regardless of our good intentions or our commitment to fairness. The question is not whether we have biases, but what we're going to do about them. The story of Lincoln Elementary had become a case study in how institutions could change when they were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. It had shown that transformation was possible, but only when people were willing to do the hard work of examining their own assumptions and practices. As Keisha looked toward the future, she was optimistic about the progress that had been made, but realistic about the challenges that lay ahead. Creating truly equitable schools would require sustained effort and commitment from everyone involved: educators, parents, students, and community members. But the foundation had been laid. The conversation had been started, and the expectation had been established that all students would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. The little girl who had been sent to the office for talking during reading time was now thriving in a classroom where her voice was valued and her potential was recognized. The mother who had been dismissed for raising concerns about her daughter's treatment was now seen as a partner in her child's education. And the principal who had once embodied the very biases she was supposed to protect against had become a champion for equity and inclusion. It was a reminder that people could change, that institutions could evolve, and that the pursuit of equity was not just a moral imperative, but a practical necessity for creating schools where all students could succeed. The work continued as it always would, but the vision of what was possible had been established, and the commitment to making it real was stronger than ever. As Keisha often said in her presentations, "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. And the future we're building is one where every child, regardless of their background or circumstances, has the opportunity to reach their full potential." That was the promise of public education, and it was a promise